All right, so today we're going to discuss the differences between competitive and non-competitive inhibition. First, let's take a look at competitive inhibition. So here is our substrate, let's say. This purple square. This is our substrate. I'm going to label this S. This will be our enzyme. E. Okay, well you can see that this substrate has an active site in this enzyme, and it looks like it's going to be a perfect fit. Okay, so let's examine what happens when you have a competitive inhibitor as the substrate is going to bind to the enzyme. A competitive inhibitor is basically what it sounds like. It is an inhibitor that is going to compete with the substrate, specifically for the active site. In that case, it needs to look pretty similar to the substrate. And I'm going to label this competitive inhibitor, CI. So this could actively compete with this substrate for the active site. Well, what is that going to do? It's going to inhibit the reaction that we are trying to accelerate. So let's look at an analogy. Let's imagine we have you standing right here. And you have a spoon. Why do you have a spoon? Well, you're about to eat some ice cream. First choice you're going to have is chocolate ice cream, Ben & Mary's. Let's say you have a really strong affinity for Ben & Mary's chocolate ice cream. You really like this chocolate ice cream. Well, you're going to use your spoon, you're going to get yourself a scoop, you're going to eat that chocolate ice cream. But what happens if you look back in this freezer and you see something else? You see next to this Ben & Mary's chocolate ice cream, you see some Ben & Mary's vanilla ice cream. Well, now let's pretend that you're a little conflicted. Ben & Mary's. So how is this an analogy? Initially, you open up the freezer, you have your spoon, you are the enzyme, that chocolate ice cream is the substrate. You are going to get yourself some chocolate ice cream. But if you look right next to that chocolate ice cream, you see some Ben & Mary's vanilla ice cream. That could be the competitive inhibitor. Now you're going to be conflicted. Your affinity, if you will, for that chocolate ice cream has decreased because of that vanilla ice cream. There are two variables to consider when looking at inhibition: Km and Vmax. Vmax is what it sounds like. It's the maximum velocity of the reaction. When you add a competitive inhibitor, you are not going to affect the maximum velocity that the reaction can reach. Because I'll tell you what, you can increase the concentration of substrate so much so that you diminish the effect of the competitive inhibitor. If you have so much substrate, the chances are that the competitive inhibitor is actually physically going to bind to an enzyme has been very diminished. Which means for a competitive inhibitor, you can out-compete a competitive inhibitor by increasing the concentration of the substrate. Your Km value will change. So this is the concentration of the substrate to get to 1/2 Vmax. In other words, this is an inverse relationship for affinity. Inverse for affinity. So let's say, as an example, you have an enzyme substrate reaction that has a very high Km. That means you need a lot of substrate. You have a high concentration of substrate in order to get to the 1/2 Vmax. If you need a lot of substrate to get to 1/2 the Vmax, that tells you that the affinity is low. If you have a very small amount of substrate and that gets you to 1/2 Vmax, and so the Km is low, that means you have a very high affinity. The competitive inhibitor is going to affect Km. It is going to increase Km. By increasing Km, you increase the concentration of the substrate that you need to get to 1/2 Vmax. By increasing Km, you decrease affinity. Now let us consider non-competitive inhibition and what the difference is for non-competitive inhibition as compared to competitive inhibition. We are going to say that there is another site on this enzyme, but this won't be our active site. This will be an allosteric site. We're going to say this is that site. And just like competitive inhibition, we need an inhibitor. Here's our inhibitor. The main difference between a competitive and non-competitive inhibitor is that a non-competitive inhibitor does not bind to the active site. It binds to this allosteric site. So it does not actively compete with the substrate for the active site. That sounds wonderful, but it's not. Because when this non-competitive inhibitor binds to this enzyme, it will change the shape of the active site. So that now, after this is bound to the enzyme, we no longer see an active site that nicely matches up with the substrate. Instead, we see an active site maybe like this. And this substrate can no longer bind. Okay, what does this mean in terms of our analogy? Again, you see Ben & Mary's chocolate ice cream, you say, yeah, I'm gonna get that chocolate ice cream. You don't see any vanilla ice cream because there is nothing competing with the affinity that you have for the chocolate ice cream. But so how does this analogy then work? In non-competitive inhibition, you do not have a spoon. You might be the enzyme and you might be present. The substrate, being the chocolate ice cream, is still present, but you are no longer able to get to it. Instead, you might have a fork. You have a fork to eat that chocolate ice cream. That's not going to work out so well. To be honest with this analogy, you're lucky to have a fork. So let's take a look at what this does with Km and Vmax. The Km does not change with a non-competitive inhibitor. The Km value does not change because the affinity for the substrate by the active site does not change. You walk up to that freezer, you're going to want that chocolate ice cream no matter what. Your affinity for that chocolate ice cream has not decreased because you have a fork. Vmax does change because some of these enzymes that are binding to these non-competitive inhibitors are effectively taken out of the picture, that the Vmax is going to decrease. And that is what happens. We see a decrease in the maximum velocity of this reaction because some of the enzymes are now effectively useless. To sum up, competitive inhibitors, you have vanilla and chocolate ice cream. You wanted that chocolate ice cream, but upon the presence of that vanilla ice cream, your affinity for the chocolate has diminished. In terms of variables, that is reflected through a non-changing Vmax and a increasing Km, i.e. affinity decreases. For non-competitive inhibitors, remember using that ice cream analogy, that no longer do you have vanilla ice cream, you only have chocolate ice cream, but now instead of a spoon, you have a fork. So your ability to get to that chocolate ice cream has now been completely diminished. Your affinity for the chocolate ice cream has not changed. So Km does not change. But Vmax has. Vmax decreases.